Good morning. I'd like to welcome those here in the Mountain West, welcome you with a good morning, and for our friends in the Eastern United States and in Latin America, good afternoon. My name is Paul Edwards, and I direct the Wheatley Institution at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. And on behalf of the Wheatley Institution, I'm pleased to welcome you to our conversation today with Dr. Yuval Levin about some of the themes in his recently published book, A Time to Build. I'm eager to formally introduce you to Dr. Levin, and will do so momentarily. But I first want to acknowledge those who've been working hard to make this happen. I'm very grateful to Nicole Penn, who works with Dr. Levin at the American Enterprise Institute, for her help in arranging today's webinar. Very grateful for the can-do staff that we have at the Wheatley Institution for their help behind the scenes. And thank you to the many financial supporters of the Wheatley Institution whose contributions help us in our work to rebuild authentic confidence in the core institutions of civil society, beginning with the family. It's our tradition and our privilege at the Wheatley Institution to begin and end our events in prayer. And I have asked Emily Reynolds, Assistant Director of the Wheatley Institution, to offer an invocation on today's proceedings. Emily?
Our Father in heaven, we are grateful for this opportunity to be together in this way. We're grateful for Dr. Levin and for the clarity that he has brought to so many important issues. And we pray that in this conversation today, that tongues will be loosed and minds clear, and that those of us who listen will be guided by thy Spirit to understand the ways that we can be tools in thy hand as we seek to resolve our many concerns about our nation at this time. We acknowledge thy hand in all that is good in our lives, and thank thee for thy goodness to us in innumerable ways. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Thank you, Emily. Appreciate that thoughtful prayer. As we get underway, let me note that we've populated the chat function in the webinar with links that have some additional information about Dr. Levin, his books, his work at the American Enterprise Institute. And there's also some information there about our next webinar on November 12th with former United States Senator from Arizona, Jeff Flake. Although the chat function is disabled for the audience, the question function is on. And I'd like all of you to make use of it during our discussion. We'll be moderating the question section, and I hope to turn to some of your questions toward the end of our time with Dr. Levin. So when I came to the Wheatley Institution just over a year ago, I embarked on what I called a listening tour. I wanted to better understand our comparative advantages and opportunities within the broader world of ideas. As you know, we've described our efforts as lifting society by preserving and enhancing the core institutions of society, beginning with the family. So as I connected with colleagues in the academy and think tanks, in government and in journalism, about who was working in smart ways to prevent the threats that we see to civility and dignity in our society, one name kept popping up, and that was the name of Yuval Levin. In fact, I was meeting with my friend Jonathan Rausch at the Brookings Institution, talking about what we were doing at the Wheatley Institution. And he literally said, "We've got to get you over to meet with Yuval, and he literally stood up from his desk and marched me next door to the American Enterprise Institute to arrange a meeting. And that's where I first came to meet Yuval in person. Of course, I've known of Yuval's important contributions from the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where he's worked so hard to keep alive the vibrant intellectual tradition that at one time was the hallmark of center-right conservatism. By founding and editing the journal National Affairs, Levin has provided one of the most thoughtful and useful forums that we currently have for the real serious intersection of ideas and policy. I also knew of his bracing and elegant work to revitalize the concepts of federalism and subsidiarity in his important book, The Fractured Republic. What I didn't know last year at this time was that Yuval had actually moved from EPPC to the American Enterprise Institute to direct this new program in social, cultural, and constitutional studies. What intrigues me so much about this program is that instead of addressing the nation's concerns at the policy level, it looks at the foundations of American social, political, and civic life. It looks upstream to the preconditions that are necessary to have flourishing families and communities. Dr. Levin brings to this important work superb training as with his graduate work at the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, unparalleled experience in government on Capitol Hill, and as a member of the White House domestic policy staff under President George W. Bush. So it's a real honor to welcome to the Wheatley Institution, Dr. Yuval Levin. It looks like you're there.
It looks like I am. Thank you for that, Paul. That's an awfully generous introduction. I appreciate it enormously.
Well, we're very grateful to be able to visit today with you, Yuval. So the book that we're talking about, A Time to Build, came out earlier this year. And the subtitle is From Family and Community to Congress and the Campus, How Recommitting to Our Institutions Can Revitalize the American Dream or Revive the American Dream. For years, we've been talking here about lifting society, preserving and enhancing our core institutions. So you're in real friendly territory. We have a lot to talk about in terms of recommitting to our institutions and a lot of common ground, but there's a common challenge that we face in this work, Yuval, and one of them is definitional.
Yeah.
The term institution, it's a 4-syllable, sterile, Latinate word that's used by social scientists in a variety of ways. What is the way that you define institutions? And why are institutions so important to a well-functioning society?
Well, I appreciate that question. You know, the term institution is almost too useful. It's so broad and fundamental that it certainly can be very hard to define. And there's a range, of course, of academic definitions. I would define institutions most simply as the durable forms of our common life. They're the shapes and structures of what we do together. And so when people come together, we're not just a clump of individuals, we're organized in some way around a goal, a task. And the shape we have, the structure of that organization gives a set of relationships to the people involved, a relation to one another, a way to understand our mutual responsibilities. And institutions really are those shapes and forms. Some institutions are really organizations and have something like a corporate form, a university, a hospital, a school, a legislature, a company, a civic association. Those are all institutions. They're technically, legally formalized. But some institutions are durable forms of a different sort. Maybe they're shaped in some way by laws or norms, but they don't have that corporate structure. The family is an institution. It's the first and foremost institution of every society. You might say that the institution of marriage is obviously an institution. A tradition, a profession is an institution. The rule of law is an institution. What's distinct about them is that they take a certain shape in the way they operate in society, and therefore they give a certain shape to the way we operate in society. I think of institutions as forms because ultimately they're formative. They shape us, they shape the people within them, and they structure our souls, they structure our habits. We're formed by them with a certain understanding of what's possible in society. And to me, that formative character of the institution is absolutely essential to what makes it so important, because we as human beings require that kind of formation in order to be able to function and live in a free society.
Okay, so in thinking about that formative nature of institutions, you write about how that has changed in some of our American institutions in, I don't know what time frame you want to put this, but tell us about that change to the formative nature of our institutions and institutional life. And
one of the defining questions of the book is really, why has the American public been losing trust in institutions? We know we've been losing that trust and confidence. That's almost a cliche by now. And one way to think about it is institutions maybe have become less competent, maybe they've become more corrupt. And I don't really think that's true. There is certainly a problem of corruption in institutional life. There always has been. There are always challenges to competence. But I think what's really distinct about our time is that we've come to think differently about what our institutions are for, so that rather than seeing them as formative, as giving shape to the people within them, defining a certain kind of human character, right? There's such a thing in the world as a father, as an accountant, as a member of Congress. These are human forms that are shaped by institutions. But instead, we increasingly come to think of institutions not as molds like that, but as platforms, as places to stand and be seen and heard in our culture, so that people use the institutions they're part of to build their own following, to build their own brand, and to display themselves, oftentimes to display themselves voicing the right opinion in the culture war, whatever that opinion might be on the side they're on. And so I'll give you some, the obvious examples maybe to begin with are in politics, where you can think now a lot of members of Congress basically use Congress as a platform for themselves, as a way to get a better time slot on cable news or a bigger following on social media. They don't seek the microphone in order to get power and then make change. They seek power to get a microphone and to be visible, and to be celebrities and to be part of the big theater. The president does this too. He thinks about the presidency as a platform, as a stage, a place to stand and talk about the government more than to work from within it. But once you see that pattern, you see it also in corporate America. You see it in a lot of ways in the academy. You find people using the institutions they're part of as a place to stand and yell, rather than letting themselves be shaped by those institutions so that they can take on a certain kind of responsibility in the world.
So with this new way of trying to be in the limelight, use the institution in that fashion, is there any kind of circuit breaker that we might have to take away that limelight from those that are misusing institutions in this way?
It's an enormous challenge, because the fact is that people within our institutions, especially our elite institutions, are ambitious people. They want to succeed naturally, and they respond to certain kinds of incentives in the structures of those institutions, so that the member of Congress who now uses Congress as a platform, that person isn't crazy. He or she is just trying to advance themselves and to do some good. They really are. But the ways that are available to them to do that now look a lot more like performance than they used to. So that, again, if we take Congress as an example, if you now attend a congressional hearing, what you find is basically a bunch of individuals producing YouTube clips to use later in campaign commercials, rather than people engaging with each other. I think a circuit breaker there would look like institutional reforms that allow them to channel their ambition to be rewarded and advanced by doing the work of legislating, rather than by doing the work of a kind of political entertainment. That would take real structural institutional reform that begins from an understanding of the problem and tries to make a case for the institution itself. I think you could say the same thing about the academy, right? Where a lot of the incentives now are to use the university as a place to stand and yell. To think instead about a university as a place to learn and teach, and to understand the paths to advancement as involving the pursuit of knowledge in an open-minded way would require changes within the university in the way it's administered, in the way that students and teachers understand their roles. You can say the same about the media. You can say the same about a lot of American institutions these days.
Now, you have been part of some of these important institutions. You served on the domestic policy team for the George W. Bush White House. And I'm kind of curious to just get, if you might, give us a sense of what it's like to be within that kind of an institution. And I'd be interested to know if, and you don't have to divulge any like confidence here or tell us, something that would be embarrassing to anyone, but were there instances in that role where your personal policy preferences were sort of rolled over, if you will, by the administration, by the White House for different reasons? And what is the responsibility when you see a good policy proposal and you're in that kind of a role? How should someone respond who cares deeply about institutions?
Yeah, that is really a great question, and there are a lot of ways I might answer it. But I would say one thing about the president and one thing about people in the sort of role that I had as an advisor to the president. I think that one thing that really stood out to me about President Bush, and I have to say in some ways President Obama was like this too, was a sense of the gravity of the institutional responsibility that he had, so that there were just, there was what he wanted and there was his personality, but there was an institution there that gave him shape. He allowed himself to, in a sense, be poured into it as a mold and take the shape of the presidency and take on the responsibilities that are involved. So that, for example, there were conversations in the Oval Office that would turn to kind of crass political questions. Is this going to be good on election day? And at certain points, the president would say, look, we can talk about that later, but first of all, we have to ask what needs to be done here. What's the right thing to do? Obviously, he was also a politician. Don't get me wrong. It's not that those things didn't matter to him, but he allowed the fact of the office, the fact of the White House, the fact of the presidency to shape how he understood what his responsibility was. And again, I think President Obama was like this too, where at a certain point you become the president in the system rather than the individual you came in as. And that certainly has an effect on the people around you and the people who work for you as well. The White House functions as an institution. There's a process. Everybody understands what it is. Everybody is involved in trying to inform a presidential decision. But once the decision is made, the decision's been made. And there were many instances. I worked on issues that involved healthcare and veterans issues, welfare, some cultural and moral issues, the life questions and abortion, where there were times when I thought we could have been more aggressive, and the president, for various reasons, decided not to be. And not only did I have to accept it, I had to defend it. I had to go out and speak to people with whom I agreed about something we had gotten wrong, and explain to them why that happened and why they should see it, in fact, as a step forward. You have to be honest. You don't say things you don't believe, but you have a responsibility to speak for the institution and to play a role in the institution, to understand that that role gives you some privileges, but also some obligations. I think that's true of a president. I think that's true of the people around him, but it's true of all of us. We all have roles to play within institutions that empower us by restraining us, that give us power by saying, this is your job. Everything else is not your job. So at this point, maybe you shouldn't be doing this and that, but this part of it is your responsibility. And before you take an action, you have to ask yourself, given that role, given that responsibility, given that I'm a teacher or a pastor or a congregant or a worker, given that, how should I think about this situation? That's a way in which thinking institutionally can be very empowering, but often by constraining us.
You have a lot of faith in what institutions can do for us. But you also, and you note this in the book, I want to be fair about this, but it seems that institutions can also mask some social pathologies.
Yes.
Last week, we had this competing town hall format for our presidential candidates. And in the Joe Biden town hall, there was a senior, an African-American student, Cedric Humphrey from the University of Pittsburgh, who asked the following question. He said, many people believe that the true swing demographic in this election will be Black voters under the age of 30, not because they'll be voting for Trump, but because they won't vote at all. I myself have had this exact same conflict. What do you say to young Black voters who see voting for you as further participation in a system that continually fails to protect them? So I think in Humphrey's question, we sense a deep cynicism about the electoral process and concerns for what we call sometimes institutionalized racism. So Biden responded, you'll remember, he talked about economic opportunity for African Americans. From an institutionalist perspective, how should today's candidates respond to a question like this? Or I guess another way of putting this is, how do we draw alienated people back into our institutions?
You know, first of all, I thought that was a wonderful question, a very difficult question, a real challenging one, and in a lot of ways, the right question in this moment. My case for institutions is not a case that's rooted in how wonderful they are. It's a case that's rooted in how much we need them. It ultimately, in a sense, is rooted in our own weakness as human beings, in our fallenness, in our need for formation and structure and relationships. And that means that there is no alternative to some core institutions in our society, so that when they fail us, we have to reform them, we have to repair them, we have to find ways to work through them. Sometimes we can replace them and we can build new institutions to achieve new goals, but not every kind of institution can be done away with or replaced. And so often our challenge is how to rebuild and recover, given the fact that institutions, being collections of human beings, often are vehicles for a certain kind of corruption, oppression. You know, the term institutionalized racism is not a metaphor. It's a real thing. It's a reality in our country. It has been and it is. And so we have to acknowledge that, we have to see that, but we also have to see that ultimately institutions are actually most needed by the people who are most vulnerable in our society. People who are strong and in power and with a lot of resources will be fine, whatever happens to our institutions. It's those who really need to defend their rights. It's those who really need to attain opportunity and to rise, who really need our institutions to function. And that means, ironically, that it's often the people who are most betrayed by our institutions who most need them to work. So that a recommitment to core institutions in America, from family and community and religion and civil society all the way to our national politics, is especially required for the people who are most vulnerable. And so, you know, that requires us to take our responsibility within the institutions that we are part of seriously, and to, again, allow it to shape us and form us, and to take from it a sense of what integrity would look like, recognizing that corruption is a real problem, oppression is a real problem, these are not imaginary, and that they often especially happen within and through our institutions, so that requires a special kind of vigilance.
You've talked a lot about the importance of family. And by the way, family is such an important research topic for us here at the Wheatley Institution. Our most vibrant research program. In fact, we just last week, a great survey came out, a great report looking at the health of families during this time of the pandemic. It looked specifically at teen mental well-being during the lockdown of the pandemic. Jean Twenge from San Diego State University, Brad Wilcox from AEI and University of Virginia, and our own Jason Carroll and Sarah Coyne here at BYU or engaged in that. And I just bring this forward because it confirmed what you might suspect, which is the kids are actually all right when they are embedded in a well-functioning family.
Yeah.
And the well-functioning families were a source of enormous resilience for the emotional well-being of teens during this last lockdown. Anyway, the reason I turn to that is you speak very convincingly about the important formative aspects of the family, and that they are a school, if you will, for our participation in other kinds of authoritative and formative institutions later on in life. But you note that the family is in decline in significant ways. So I'm actually interested to hear from you. I want to give you the power in this conversation to pull 2 or 3 big levers. They could be a lever, a social lever, a policy lever, a technology lever. Can you think of some important levers out there that would make a difference in increasing family formation and increasing persistence in marital relationships?
Yeah, it's a wonderful and difficult question. And I think the way that you approached it is the way to begin, which is that in some ways what's important about family and a lot of our social institutions is the idea of embeddedness, of being part of a larger whole that gives you a sense of what your relation to others is. It makes it a little harder to believe in the fantasy of pure individualism, which is a fantasy we live with in America. There's some good things about it. But ultimately, we have to recognize that all of us are dependent on one another, that there are people who depend on us, that there are people upon whom we depend. And the family is really the great teacher of that fact in our society. It just won't put up with the fantasy. It doesn't make sense in the family. And it's where we learn the limits of liberal individualism for all of its benefits and for all of its reach. It is certainly true that we have lived through a dramatic multi-generational collapse of family structure. And structure matters, right? If you think about the way that I'm describing institutions, they're all about structure. And so I do think that it's enormously important to look for ways to help people back toward family structure, toward marriage, towards lasting relationships. And there's no easy way to do that. The attempts to do that through public policy, even where they've been successful, have been successful at the margins. It can really only happen through culture, through example. It has to be the norm, right? People have to assume that this is what you do in life. This is how you move forward. And you can't just tell people that. It has to be what they see happening around them. And that's part of what makes it so difficult to advance that kind of change. Now, there are ways that other institutions can provide people with supports that make it possible to thrive despite collapsing family structure. And I do think we have to recognize those. I mean, I would say if you told an American in 1950 that in 2020, a third of all children in our society would be born outside of marriage, that 80% of African-American children will be born outside of marriage, and that the numbers were rising for the prior 50 years, and then ask that person to describe our society, they would describe a society in much worse shape than the one ours actually is in. We have managed to find ways, often through the heroic efforts of single parents, frankly, to allow people to thrive and survive. And we have to look for ways to make that possible because we can't simply reverse what's happened. But I do think we also need to look for ways to help people see that ultimately family formation is the way forward and the way up, that it's not just about restraint and obligation, that it's enormously and beautifully liberating. And I think that can only be done through example. You know, our traditional communities, our religious communities, which are so committed to this model of the family, the best that they can really do for the large society is to model the kind of thriving and happiness that happens when a family is strong. To just do it and let people see it and let people see how you flourish in doing it. ultimately everything else is much less likely to succeed. And I think the most persuasive arguments that can be made on these issues in our society now are examples more than they are arguments.
You know, I love this point, Yuval, about the role that faith communities can play in helping to model this. None of us came with a handbook for our families. I mean, I know people publish a lot of parenting books and things that are out there, but I know for myself, and this may be true for you and your wife, Cecilia, that it's seeing people within a community just ahead of us. I mean, it's so helpful to have see people that had kids a few years older than us and how they dealt with, you know, just the formation of those children.
Yeah. And, you know, I have to say, this is in a way what all of our institutions do, is they provide us with models of what it is to be a certain human type, so that implicitly you arrive at the conclusion that to be a father or a mother is to be this kind of person in this sort of situation. But it's true in other institutions too. There's a way of being in the world. There's such a thing as an accountant, a physician. You can say to yourself, well, that's not what a doctor should be doing in this situation. And that actually means something. And the reason it does has to do with the formative power of that profession as an institution, or the formative power of family as an institution. That ultimately is really how we learn to be human beings. It is by a kind of modeling that depends on strong institutional formation.
So let's talk for a moment about faith communities. And again, we've noted in our little conversation here how they've been important in our own lives, but you know, very important in their capacity to answer ultimate questions, to form character, bring people together. But you note, and I'm going to quote here, that our institutions of faith are in peril, not just because they are under attack, but also because they too often fail to live up to their obligations. And in the book, you don't pull any punches about the challenges with the sexual abuse and cover up in the Catholic Church, some of the personality-driven scandals within some other Christian denominations. So we see especially millennials leaving churches and houses of worship, organized religion in very large numbers. Given the kind of hypocrisy, the internal turmoil that they see within religious institutions, couldn't we step back and say what they're doing is really evidence of a kind of conscientious moral decision to not be a part of those kinds of things rather than evidence of spiritual apathy?
I do think that's true in part, and I don't think that we really are living in a time of spiritual apathy. In some ways, even the culture war that we're part of, that we can't help but all be part of, neither side is apathetic. I think that this is a struggle between two kinds of moralism, between two ways of understanding justice and the pursuit of it. And we do have to recognize even people we disagree with are generally moved by an intense moral passion. And the challenge is, how can that be channeled in ways that are constructive and healthy, so that just simply a conscientious objector status is not enough. To say that this institution is corrupt and I'm going to exit out of it is one thing. But you then have to say what you will do then, what you will do next to help your community, to offer a place for others who might feel the same way but are in search of some form of the truth. You know, our religious institutions are not first and foremost socially useful, right? They're first and foremost paths to the highest truth. But they also play an extremely important role in the life of our society. I don't think either of those functions can be advanced without some institutional form and structure. And that means that when things aren't working, when there's corruption, when there's a failure to live up to standards, we have to save the institution, not burn the institution. I think that's true in a broader sense about this moment in America, where a lot of our frustration with what's failing is channeled into an attitude that says, drain the swamp, burn it all down, get rid of it, and then we'll be free. But that's not what freedom looks like. We have to think about what we need to build, not what we need to destroy. We have to think about what we don't have, not what we have too much of. And that's hard to do when you're frustrated, but it's absolutely essential. So what I would say to people who are justifiably fed up with corruption in a religious institution that makes moral claims, and it's true not only in various Christian denominations, it's certainly true in my own Jewish community, it's true in any human community. Ultimately, there is corruption to be seen. We have to respond to that by trying to build what's missing and not just by tearing down what's failing. That's very hard. It's much easier to just say, I don't need this, and know what you're against. But we have to know what we're for, because ultimately we do depend on the formative power of truly responsible, reliable, admirable, honest institutions.
So we are in conversation here with Dr. Yuval Levin about his book, A Time to Build. And we're getting some great questions being asked here, Yuval, and I want to turn to some of what our audience is asking here. So let me pull up a few questions here. This is from Janie Mitchell in the School of Education here at Brigham Young University. And she asks, how has the emergence of social media as a metric of achievement altered the way we view our democracy? And is there a way back from leading by Twitter feed?
Yeah, this is a great question. And but before I dive into attacking social media, which I'm going to do, I think it's worth noting that there are good things about social media, and that the intentions behind it have always been about reinforcing our sociality, about connecting people. Obviously, there are also just corporate intentions behind it and a business model. But I do think that a lot of it comes from a desire to connect people. I think it comes from also a misperception of what's needed on that front. There's a kind of sense we all have that American society is this big open space and people are having trouble connecting. And so they need ways to hold hands, to build bridges, to tear down walls. There's truth to that. But ultimately, what's missing are forms of connection, real solidarity, structures of affiliation, so that what we need are not just ways of connecting as individuals, but institutions that will structure our relations to one another. Social media undermines that, I think, because it leaves us, first of all, it treats us as individuals, it connects us as individuals, but it also leaves us with the impression that expression is a form of action, and expression is a very limited form of action. Social media basically enables us to say where we stand. It is literally a platform, and only a platform, where we can stand and say what we think, or even more often, we can hear somebody say something and all of us can stand up and give that person a thumbs up. Well, that's nice, but that's not actually a way to advance change in society. And it's not even really a way to connect. So I worry that social media reinforces an idea of human sociality that looks too much like blind affirmation, that looks too much like shallow expression, and looks too little like civic engagement and human relations. And as it comes to not only supplement our social lives, but really substitute for them, to become the way we engage with other people, we do lose some of the capacity to hear people we don't agree with, which social media makes it very easy for us to avoid, and to engage with people who just need help, and not through forms of expression, but through forms of action. It also, in a very particular way, undermines our capacity to function as a community and as a democracy. I will tell you my experience on Facebook, for example. I'm not on Twitter, as it happens. I think it would drive me crazy. But I am on Facebook, and because I am, on the one hand, a conservative and involved in the conservative world of ideas, a lot of people in my Facebook feeds are conservatives. But on the other hand, I'm Jewish, I'm an immigrant, I was born in New Jersey, I have a PhD. I know a lot of people who are very far on the left. And what you find on Facebook is that these are two completely separate and distinct islands of humanity. They think they're angry at each other, but they actually don't know each other at all. They're each angry, that's for sure. But generally speaking, on most days of the week, each of them is angry about something that the others never even heard about. And they live in their own world, and that world echoes a lot, and so much so that they don't hear the other at all. This is just plainly, obviously bad for our social life, our civic life, our political life. It reinforces polarization and makes it very difficult for people to connect with each other. And I think the solution to that is ultimately some kind of localism, some kind of connection with people who are actually around you, but may not be like you. And, that means community action. It means civic engagement.
Thank you. We have another question from School of Education. Michelle Price asks, tonight we will view the final debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden with lingering frustration over what we saw in their last debate. What can we do as individuals to sift through the rhetoric and rude behaviors and get something meaningful out of the event? Are there questions that we can ask ourselves in preparation that will help us focus on what we might be offered?
Well, it's an enormous challenge, and this year more than most, in a variety of ways. I mean, I would say that one of the challenging things about this particular election campaign is that it isn't really about policy differences. We can sort of imagine what the differences are. We kind of know what they are. Sometimes they come up. But this campaign is really about each party arguing that the other party is the country's biggest problem, and each candidate arguing that the best thing about him is that he's not the other candidate. It's almost pure, unmitigated polarization. And that makes it very hard as a citizen to really think about your options. I think we've got to think our way forward from this situation and ask ourselves what it would take to get back to a politics that is about the country's problems rather than that treats the opposite party as the country's only and biggest problem. Some of what it would take is a kind of generational change. I think it matters that these two candidates are 78 and 74 years old. The Speaker of the House is 80 years old. The Majority Leader of the Senate is 78. That's a very unusual situation. And look, I don't have anything against people in their 70s, don't get me wrong. But I think that the politics of a free society has to be about the future. And it is very hard for a politics where everyone is 80 to really be about the future. A lot of our politics is about long-standing grudges that younger voters can't even possibly comprehend. Very little of it is about what we're going to need in 2040, which is not in an impossible science fiction future. It's as close to us now as the year 2000. Our politics is not about 2040 in any way. I mean, if you ask yourself, at what point do they talk about what we need to build for the future? It does not happen in this mode of political engagement. I think that's a challenge for the younger generation to take up. And there are some promising younger politicians in both of our parties in different ways. But I think it's also a challenge for us to take up and to ask ourselves how we get at the underlying problems of political culture that are not about policy exactly. They're pre-policy. They're about, it's necessary to address them before we can even have policy debates. And I think that has to do with accepting the existence of the other party, what we call civility, which is really just about acknowledging that people you disagree with aren't going away. It's about understanding that our political institutions are there to enable accommodation and compromise, which is plainly their purpose, though it's very rarely what we think about when we think about politics. And I think recovering that sense of what our political life is for and putting it in proper proportion is the challenge for us and the challenge for the rising generation.
I think we all regret that we don't have you on the debate stage tonight, Yuval. So,
well, I don't regret that, but
let me. You talk about 2040. I actually want to take you back to the 18th century with the next question here. This is from Jonathan Pike, a former student at BYU and a former employee of the Wheatley Institution. And Jonathan asks, the late 18th century member of Parliament, Edmund Burke, favored the American Revolution, but not the French, in large measure due to their different treatment of institutions. what lessons does the French Revolution hold for our day in relation to the fragility of institutions in the midst of mob violence and the impact on society in the absence of institutions, or at least periods of their rapid evolution and or replacement?
Wow, that's almost a question I would have planted if I could have planted a question. Edmund Burke, who was the subject of my dissertation and of a book I wrote about 6 years ago called The Great Debate, I think actually sheds a lot of light on some of the challenges we face now. And it is just in this way, in thinking about the significance of durable institutions in the life of a society. In some ways, the ethic of the French Revolution was the pursuit of justice through the uprooting of society's institutions. The idea being human beings are ready and able to live free and just lives if only oppressive institutions were cleared away. And that begins from a very high expectation of the human person, and therefore has very low expectations of our institutions. Burke, who was a British politician in that time and who made the first real case against the French Revolution very early, before it went bad, before it went to the terror, long before, argued against that premise and basically said, look, we have to begin from lower expectations of the human person, but therefore higher expectations of institutions. We are fallen and imperfect. We need formation. We need structure. And our societies only really learn how to do that over time, so that our inherited institutions that have evolved over long stretches of time to serve us well need to be preserved. And when they become corrupt or incapable, they need to be corrected and perfected and improved, not thrown out. And what Burke saw in the American Revolution was a willingness to sustain pre-existing political institutions while still overcoming a significant injustice and changing the political order. The American Revolution, you look at the Declaration of Independence, it begins with a very radical assertion of principles and then moves to a set of grievances that are actually quite conservative, that basically say, we've lived in a certain way for more than 200 years in these colonies, and now we're being denied that by the Crown. That combination of the radical and the conservative, which is really distinct to the American Revolution, made it possible for that revolution to result in a stable regime. The French Revolution didn't have that balance and really was a revolution of overturning and overthrowing, of frustration and burning down. And it failed because we do require structure. We do require tradition. We do require some molding and forming institutions. And I think it's an important lesson of that time. It's something we should keep in mind when we see radicalism in our own time. But the alternative to it isn't just no change. It's not the status quo. It's a mode of change that recognizes that change that happens gradually by building on what's good to address what's bad is more likely to endure.
Okay. Well, I regret we're coming to the end of our hour here with you, Yuval. When we met before, I talked about possibly doing a conference here at BYU. We had hoped to do that this fall. Of course, COVID has changed a number of different things. We still hope that we can do that in the not too distant future, because there is so much in this book that so many themes that lend themselves to deeper exploration than the short 45 minutes that we've had today. I do, as we finish up here, I was thinking, we have a lot of Brigham Young University students in the audience today listening in, and there's this fabulous book by David Brooks, The Road to Character. And he begins that book talking, the first chapter is about Francis Perkins. And there's this story in there where Francis Perkins, very genteel, very well-trained young, I think at that point teaching college. She'd been at Holyoke as a student, and actually studied economics at Wharton, is my understanding. Anyway, she's having tea in Greenwich Village near Washington Square when a fire breaks out. And it happens to be the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, which is important in American labor history as a pivotal moment. And part of the importance here is that it was a pivotal moment for Frances Perkins herself. She, in rushing to the fire and seeing the horror that's unfolding, is literally, I think it was close to 150 people die in this fire because of mismanagement of the factory. She changes her direction in life and says that she will become an advocate for the worker. And of course, she later becomes the first female cabinet secretary in the United States, plays a huge role in the New Deal. And whether you agree with these policies or not, huge impact in the creation of Social Security, the Fair Labor Practices Act, longest serving labor secretary in our history. And Brooks uses this because he says, young people aren't, character and the opportunity to make a difference don't come from following your bliss. They come from being summoned to something. She ran towards the fire and it changed her life. In just a few moments here, what are the fires, the metaphorical fires that students should be running to today to make a difference in our world?
Well, it's a great question, and I certainly agree with the premise that ultimately that's often how our lives are shaped. I think that there are a great variety of problems that might attract our attention and our good intentions, but I do think that there's a category of problems now that have to do with a shortage of solidarity in our society, with a sense that too many Americans have that this society is not theirs and is not for them. And I think that if we're looking for ways to do good, we have to look for ways to help people speak about this country and think about this country in the first person plural, as we and our and ours, not they or you or yours. And there are ways of doing that that involve social policy, that involve education and teaching. There are ways of doing that that involve ways of thinking about foreign policy and domestic policy. More than anything, there are ways of doing that in your own community by just simply reaching out and saying, actually, this is your community, to people who are alienated or who feel like they're treated unjustly. I think that there are ways of doing that that can speak to people whose political instincts are on the right and to people whose political instincts are on the left, but that this broad category of challenges of what I would call alienation, the sense that so many of our fellow citizens have, that this isn't for them and it's not about them, answering that in a practical way, whether that's by building institutions, by performing a service, by teaching or learning with people, by helping immigrants to find a home here. There's so many different ways to do it, but to help more Americans think about this country as their country seems to me to be the challenge of the hour for all of us.
Yuval, thank you for being our trusted guide today as we're seeking to better understand the promise that we can find through recommitting to our institutions.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
And we hope this is the beginning of a long and productive dialogue between our respective organizations. So our tradition is to conclude with a word of prayer. Ralph Hancock, a professor of political science at Brigham Young University and a fellow at the Wheatley Institution, is going to offer that benediction. And following the benediction, Yuval has graciously agreed to stay online with us for a few more minutes to take questions directly from students enrolled in Dr. Hancock's seminar on democracy in America. So I'm going to turn the time over to Dr. Hancock.
Our Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for this opportunity to confer together, to learn together, to consider together the institutions that form us and to which we can contribute. We are thankful, Heavenly Father, for the Wheatley Institution, for its sponsor, Brigham Young University, and for the sponsor of both the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We thank thee for these institutions that form and guide us and that have made this meeting possible. We're thankful, Heavenly Father, for Dr. Levin's diligent, courageous, and discerning work to consider the good of our communities, the good of our country, and how we might better build these goods and heal wounds that are preventing our institutions from doing their good work. Father, we ask you to bless each of us in the pursuit of our calling as it pertains to our institutions, our families, our churches, our neighborhoods, our country, that we may see a way to act for the good and to be an example and encouragement to others to feel involved in a common good, and that we may see this common good in the light of thy highest and ultimate purposes for us. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you, Ralph. And again, Yuval, this has been great. And we're now going to bring on a number of students, and I'm curious to see how this is going to play out here. I'm looking to people in the room here, but I think students in the class are going to be elevated to the role of panelists.
Yes, I see them appearing here, Paul. They are joining us.
Okay. And then they need to be instructed to unmute and start their video. And then I think they'll be on with us as a class. Look at that. I'm starting to see this.
These are some terrific, amazingly thoughtful and good-hearted students. If I may say, the perfect audience for Dr. Levin's counsel and encouragement.
Okay, so I'm going to just I think that you've been reading Democracy in America. Ralph, do you want to call on some of the students for particular questions or give any preface to the next few minutes here?
Well, I will call on all of them, just as I do in class. I would be very eager to, a firm handshake to the first student who steps forward to advance our discussion. Yuval, yes, I often incentivize students with this promise of a firm. It has to be a digital handshake.
I got to try that.
Yeah. So who Mr. Levin is very friendly and understanding interlocutor, so fear not, but I know you have questions. You're probably teeming with questions and concerns. So go ahead and step forward. Were you gesturing, Zach? Do I see your hand raising there? Let's let Zach start us out then.
Okay, Dr. Levin. So in I think it's chapter 7 that I've got open right now. In talking about, after you get through your section where you talk about churches and other deep institutions like the family, you have a paragraph that I'd kind of like some of your thoughts on a little more in depth, if that's all right. It says, this means that if we are to draw people into meaningful relations within mediating institutions, we must first find ways to help those institutions matter again in practical terms. That would require, among other things, looking for ways to redirect those systems of mutual aid, welfare, education, and other services through rather than around our civic institutions. So I guess my question is, if we can get some more of your thoughts on what that might look like in a real world setting.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question and thanks in general for this chance to talk to students. I hope you all know how lucky you are to have Ralph Hancock for a teacher. We sort of all have Ralph Hancock for a teacher, but you really do. So that paragraph that you cite comes in the course of a discussion about really a kind of principle of classical sociology, which is that people don't come together just to be together. People come together to do something together. So that if the problem we have seems like a problem of disaffiliation, alienation, people not coming together, the answer to it can't just be to create venues, to create structures and say, come, show up, meet your neighbors, be nice to them. You know, that's nice. And some people will do that some of the time. But ultimately, if there's not a purpose being served, if there's not a common need being met, then it's not likely that those kinds of institutions are going to succeed at drawing people into them. And that means that if we want to help to revitalize civil society and those middle layers between the individual and the nation, we have to allow some of the kinds of services that over the past century have become public services to be channeled through these mediating institutions so that welfare can function through local institutions, whether they're religious or secular, so that decisions about education can be made near at hand, can be made by parents, can be made by families and communities, rather than being made far away, so that even if they're made well far away, they don't draw people in, they don't give people a role in the lives of their own communities. And I think it's enormously important to try to enable a kind of subsidiarity by which power resides as close to the ground as it reasonably can, right? Not everything can be done at the local level. I don't think you can make decisions about national security or even environmental protection really at the local level. Those have to be national judgments. But there are a lot of other decisions about how to help people rise, especially about what we think of as social policy, that ought to be local. That ought to be local because they give people a role that way, but also because problems look different in different parts of our society. And how to help people who are dealing with addiction or who are in abusive situations or who need help rising is a question that ought to be addressed by community institutions, by a range of such institutions, so that people who receive services have some choices and options for themselves. I think that ends up being a more effective way to engage in social policy, and it also is better for this larger purpose of advancing solidarity and driving people together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do I see a question forming with Luke Lyman out there? Luke?
Yes, so that's good because I actually just came up with it. So I've been reading a lot of work of like early modernist poets like T.S. Eliot, Yeats, Auden, and some others. And each of these authors seem to foresee the institutional degradation that has so come to the fore in these recent years. Like Yeats wrote that the center cannot hold, and all of Eliot's Wasteland is more or less about this degradation and it's like on an intimate level. So my question is, if these authors were able to foresee these degradations so many decades ago, back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, do you think that means that there was something present in our situation or in our constitution of the Western world back then that is still affecting us now, but was present back then too?
It's an excellent question. And in some ways, it's even more complicated than that, because if you're reading Democracy in America, then you know that some of these problems were evident to Alexis de Tocqueville in the 1830s. And in forms that looked a lot like the challenges we have now, the dangers of individualism, its tendency to draw people away from communal obligations and responsibilities, to sort of lower their gaze and leave them less responsible. These problems, it turns out, have been around for a long time. I think there are a couple of different ways to think about what that means. Part of it is that these are enduring human problems. And enduring human problems really do arise in every generation. They're just a function of human nature at some level, and whatever actions we might take to mitigate, to address them, they have a way of coming back. And there is a kind of pattern, a cyclical pattern. If you think about solidarity in American life, for example, and look at the pattern of the last 100 years, say, in the United States, you would find there a very clear trajectory where in the first half of the 20th century, we see growing solidarity and social cohesion. America at mid-century was incredibly cohesive, in some ways much too cohesive. And the American culture of the 1950s understood itself as oppressed by conformism. And then beginning in the 1960s, you start to see a kind of liberalization, both social and economic, that has led us to a place now where we feel like things have come apart. And not only is there no conformity, there's no cohesion, there's no solidarity. You know, in some ways, there's a kind of pendulum that operates in this way. Robert Putnam, the social scientist at Harvard, has a new book out called The Upswing that tells this story in a powerful way. So I think that's part of it. Part of it really is an actual back and forth process of social change, where we respond to our problems, and in the process of doing that, we create other problems that then have to be responded to by a later generation. I do think, though, also that in the writers you point to in particular, there was an exquisite kind of sensitivity to spiritual and moral deprivation and poverty. They understood something about the ways that both the growing market orientation of Western life, economic life, and the growing kind of bureaucratization and technocracy, that is a force from the right and a force from the left in a direction of a kind of libertarianism, had a tendency to rob our social life of its substance and of its moral purpose. They worried about that, and they were right to worry about it. We worry about it now, and we're right too. I think in some ways it is worse today. We've seen some of the implications of it and the consequences of it. But look, there are also a lot of ways in which life today is much improved over American and Western life in the 1920s and 30s, naturally. And so I think we have to see these kinds of social trade-offs as they happen. But the warning you get from T.S. Eliot about the moral character of life in a free society is a warning to take seriously. It certainly speaks to our time.
We probably have time for one more question. And as we're going to that, I just want to note that over in the chat section, we've provided a link to Yuval's review of Robert Putnam's and Shailin Romney Garrett's new book, Upswing, that was published in the Wall Street Journal, because I think it's very relevant to the themes we've been talking about today. You may want to check that out.
I think Elizabeth would have a question for us.
Yeah, I was wondering, you mentioned earlier in the webinar today about how the most vulnerable are the ones that need the institutions. So they are the ones that see they're losing the faith in the institutions the most, and they need them the most. But you just mentioned how the powerful can kind of, in a way, go without it. If it's easier for them to have an institution be a platform than letting something change you. How can we help those who are powerful, who maybe don't need the institutions, realize that they do need them?
Yeah.
Because I feel like we see a lot of people in large positions saying, oh, we speak for this group or we speak for that group, while they live very different lives in those groups, but they don't really value the institutions that these groups need. So how can we inspire that and help become people that will value institutions?
Well, thank you. It's an enormously important question. And in a way, it's where the book ends, by thinking about meritocracy and by thinking about the elite that governs our society through its various institutions. One of the things that happens when you start to think about our institutions as platforms for performance is that not only do we think of them less as existing to serve a larger society, we also think of them less as constraining the powerful by giving them responsibilities. And it seems to me that understanding the role of an elite in a free society through the prism of institutions, that is, the privileges you get by having a powerful position, come with responsibilities, with restraints and constraints. To be a professional at the top of your field is not only to have a free range to do a lot of things you want to do. It's also a set of responsibilities and obligations. A profession comes with obligations. Leadership comes with responsibilities. I think that's harder to see at this point, and it's not. One of the reasons people lose faith in these institutions is that it's just less true that the people who run them behave as though they have obligations and responsibilities. That's part of what it means to lose confidence in those institutions. I think a recovery of an institutional ethic that says my role here shapes what I can and can't do, therefore would be both useful to the people who need the institutions and constraining, but in an elevating sort of way for the people who run the institutions, so that the solution looks similar. But look, it's much harder to get those people to see that they should want this, that they're part of the problem, or we're part of the problem. I mean, you know, all of us in some ways have some position of responsibility somewhere as adults in some set of institutions. And to see that that comes with obligations can be the hardest thing of all. I think it has to be demanded by the larger society. It has to be expected by the larger society. And right now we are very bad at conveying that expectation. It's not how we think at all.
Well, you've been very generous with your time. I think we said 20 minutes past the end of that webinar, and we're kind of at that point. So much more to talk about. I do promise that when this dreaded virus recedes and we're able to travel, that we'll create an opportunity to have you here at the Brigham Young University campus. You can see behind Elizabeth there the bright blue sky that we have.
Yes, looks wonderful.
And what you can't see are the beautiful autumn leaves that are all over the mountains, although maybe she can tell.
There you go.
And anyway, it will be a real pleasure.
I would love that. Thank you.
And we look forward again to ongoing dialogue. And thank you, students, for your preparation and engagement today. We'll say goodbye for now. Thank you.
Thank you.